father was a medical doctor, and Tezuka himself trained to become a physician, but he was distracted obsessively by illustration and by drawing and by telling stories. And Tezuka's early work is really a template for what we call manga or anime today. And the reason I say that is because the form developed very, very differently from what we consider American cartoons or Western-style cartoons, principally American-style cartoons. Tezuka was working in the years after the war when the publishing industry in Japan, along with most industries, had virtually entirely collapsed. So there was a sense of freedom on behalf of artists of that time. Tezuka was not alone, but he was among the most ambitious. And he literally illustrated his comics and sold them, his manga, on the streets of Osaka and later Tokyo. He was out in the streets selling these things to passers-by. Consequently, he was able to draw more or less whatever he wanted to. He could illustrate a racy story. He could illustrate darker psychological themes and tell stories about traumatic experiences, which of course at the time Japan was rife with trauma. In the years after the war, aside from the 2 atomic bombs, which are often cited by non-Japanese, most Japanese who lived through that era will talk about, on the one hand, the devastation of Japanese cities vis-a-vis American firebombing. The firebombings in particular of Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe were absolutely devastating and resulted in many more deaths than the atomic bombs. In fact, as my mother and my Japanese uncle often point out to me, in the 1940s, in the absence of news and media networks and technology, they actually had no idea that 2 atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki until actually almost 2 years later. They didn't even know that this had happened. Now, they were living in northern Japan, in Morioka, which was at that time a fairly small city. What they did know, and what most Japanese heard at the time, was the voice of the emperor issuing out over the radio announcing that Japan had surrendered. And this is in many ways what a lot of Japanese cite as the most devastating and humiliating experience of the post-war era. The emperor at the time was considered divine, godly, and so much so that were he to pass you, if the emperor's procession passed you on the street, a commoner was not supposed to even look at the emperor. In other words, you were supposed to cower and shield your eyes and not even make direct eye contact with the emperor's procession. So the suddenness of the announcement of defeat, on the one hand, and this has a kind of comic edge in retrospect, the sheer meekness of his voice. The Emperor Hirohito, was a fairly diminutive man. And when his meek and quavering voice issued over the airwaves announcing that Japan had surrendered, it came as a bolt of shock to many Japanese. And this was followed by a visual representation, which was run on many newspapers around the world at the time. A photograph, which is now quite famous, of General Douglas MacArthur, the American head of the occupation, who was a fairly tall, somewhat stout fellow in his uniform, a decorated uniform, smoking a pipe and standing adjacent to Emperor Hirohito, who was a fairly short, as I said, diminutive man in his coat and tails with his round glasses next to MacArthur. And the image, combined with the sound of the emperor's voice and the notion that the emperor was no longer divine, was stripped of his divinity, was a great blow to the Japanese mythology of the nation, the sense of Japan as divinely blessed, a nation that would be protected from the evils of war, a nation that would succeed at all costs, and a nation that was governed by this godly figure, was all torn asunder very, very quickly. And so the psychological drama or psychodrama of that event is often what Japanese I've interviewed who lived through that period cite as being far more devastating than the news of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is not to discount, obviously, the extraordinary destruction and loss of life in those events. But I think it's important when discussing the psychological bases for anime and manga, how they emerged and what colored their character, to discuss the actual deeper psychological trauma that could be expressed in these art forms. So unlike concomitantly in the United States, where comic books and animation were largely considered for kids, and I should footnote this by mentioning that there was a very strong and vibrant underground American comics movement that was, as part of the sort of McCarthy purge, shut down by a comics code issued by the American government that declared no blood, no gore, no sexuality. And there is a terrific book on this if you're interested in what happened in America at roughly the same time. There's a book called The 10-Cent Plague, written by David Haydew, which came out, I think, last year, actually, in which he covers precisely why the American comics and animation industry did not develop with the kind of sophistication and psychological depth and richness that characterizes the Japanese manga and anime industry. It was literally shut down from above. This did not happen in Japan. In Japan, artists like Tezuka were free to draw and disseminate more or less whatever they wished. And at the same time, there was an influx of Western culture, Western popular culture, in particular American popular culture. So Tezuka and his colleagues, in particular the Yoshida brothers, who were the founders of Tatsunoko Production Company, and I mention them because they produced Speed Racer, which was a title that became a Hollywood motion picture just last year, actually, maybe unfortunately, but it did happen. These artists were working in an atmosphere of real libertarian fearlessness. And I often compare, to talk about the atmosphere in which they were working and the expressions that they were pursuing, something roughly analogous to the atmosphere in the United Kingdom in the mid to late 1970s, when so much of what we now label punk music or garage music was being born. And of course not only there, but in New York City as well, with a lot of the bands that were playing in places like Max's Kansas City and the very early CBGBs, which is no longer here. The atmosphere was very free, but it was also homemade. Japanese popular culture in the form of anime and manga grew out of a very lowbrow, low overhead atmosphere. These were not artists who were being published by corporations or by businesses. They were doing their own work. They were doing it with a great deal of freedom. And they were, I think it's fair to say, on the one hand, playing with the American imagery that was coming in. Television shows like Father Knows Best were being shown on Japanese television stations. This is partly because at the time Japan had not developed a domestic television industry, so if you had the technology, you just imported the programming. American professional wrestling was shown in Japan, and in fact at the time wrestlers would travel to Japan from the United States to put on shows. jazz music, jazz performers would